15 years, I have been researching and mainly writing about, occasionally designing for, a field which is much neglected, in which there's been enormous problems in this country, but it's this field of buildings that combine dwelling and workplace, which I call work homes. And as far as I'm concerned, live-work is a little tiny blob in the middle of that that's caused an enormous amount of difficulty here, but that the work home, this building type that combines dwelling and workplace, is a building type that's existed for thousands of years in every country, in every culture across the world. And I think it has enormous contemporary relevance. So work and home in the context of Lewis's cultural infrastructure. I have to tell you, I'm not from Lewis. I've never worked in Lewis. I don't know that much about Lewis. I've got a son that lives in Brighton and a few friends who live here. But so what I'm hoping is that the work that I've done, we will be able to find ways for it to apply to the situation that Lewis finds itself. And I think we will. So cultural infrastructure in terms of work and home, I have been thinking quite a lot about creative producers, fine artists, makers, whatever. So I want to start with the idea of housing, which is enormously problematic in this country, and to put in, if you like, a central idea that in the UK we have what is fundamentally a property-based economy. Our buildings, if we're lucky to own them, enough to own anything, earn more than we do in a year. So this is one of the primary generators of wealth in this country. And as a result, the people who produce the buildings, because their primary motivation is to maximize profit and not to create places that are appropriate to people's lives, this is the sort of thing that we get. Okay? And in a way, they are very little different from the buildings that were built 100 years ago. And these buildings, there's a really interesting history to the way that housing developed. These buildings were designed specifically to prevent home-based work. Okay? And they were governed through tenancy agreements that prohibited it. So Becontree, this housing estate, built in the 20s and 30s, 20,000 homes in which no one was allowed to work from home. And as a result, that sort of kicked off, if you like, the whole idea of the housewife. Because before that, all family members were involved in family production, a family-based economy. And then suddenly, they weren't allowed to work from home, so the men had to go out to work and the women stayed at home and looked after children. And these buildings, this is so that was the housing version, and if you like, this is the apartments version. I'm sorry, you can't see the text. Never mind. Maybe what does it say? It basically says all it says is it names what it is. It's Catherine Building. It's a building that was built in 1889, I think. And it was designed, it's where the slums were cleared in the East End of London, and the housing that was built to replace it was built like this, specifically ironing out all the nooks and crannies, the urban grain that John talked about, in which home-based work happened. We have moved forward very little in the last 100 years. But of course, today, with more women in employment than ever before, with changes to technologies, new technologies, information technologies, etc., we've got this sort of vast resurgence of home-based work in all sorts of areas, but particularly in the arts and in the creative sector. So an astonishing piece of research that's come out recently from the University of Southampton is that 95% of all UK businesses are micro businesses. That means they employ less than 10 people. They provide a third of all employment, a fifth of overall turnover in the UK, and most are or have been at some time run from the home of the owner. And this is really particularly the case for those involved in creative production. And my work has involved interviewing hundreds of people, and this is a textiles designer maker in social housing with a health problem. That means that she's allocated social housing, but the social housing is designed in such a way that it makes it nearly impossible for her to do her work. So the buildings that we build today, the housing that we build today, is designed so we can cook, eat, bathe, sleep, and watch television, bring up our children, and nothing else. And this causes enormous problems, and the sort of visual artists amongst you, or those who have involved in that sector at all, will be well aware of the difficulties of trying to do those sorts of occupations in the sort of housing that is generally provided. However, we used to design really amazing buildings that combine dwelling and workplace. This is a scheme of cottage factories in Coventry, and you can see, I haven't got a pointer, but they're little 2 up, 2 down houses with 2 up, 2 down houses on the ground and first floor here, with an enormous reading studio above. And the innovation in this project is that they were built in a more or less triangular block, and in the middle of the block there was a steam engine. And so what happened was that there was a collective drive shaft that actually ran all the way along, which meant that the weavers, when the power loom was invented, there was enormous pressure on the weavers to have to go to work in factories. There was a massive resistance to that. They didn't want to. They didn't want to go. They enjoyed home-based work. One of the things about my research is what I've found is that people moan like hell, but at the end of the interview, they moan about all the problems of home-based work. At the end of the interview, they go, but I love it. I wouldn't do anything else. All the people I've interviewed, I think I've only got about 6 or 7 who go, I hate it. If I had any other option, I'd go out to work. So these people managed to compete with their factory-based peers because they had this drive shaft and they could hook up their own power loom to a collective power source. The fact that they were all working around this block. In the middle of the block there were allotments. It meant that when they took a break, they could go down, dig their allotment, meet their neighbours. All the problems that people actually, all the problems that people actually identify with home-based work today are not intrinsic to home-based work. They're intrinsic to home-based work being carried out in buildings specifically designed to prevent home-based work. Okay, so we could do it. I mean, I think these are incredibly interesting models, but what you have to do if you want to design and build for home-based work is you have to decide to do that before you build an apartment block. Okay, this is another scheme in Elephant and Castle in London. From the street it looks like a perfectly normal housing scheme, but at the back each house is linked internally to a set of, so you've got, to go back, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 stories of apartments, and then the ground and first floor apartments have an internal link to these workshops here, and this with a mews entrance, a mews access way. This shows the section. I haven't got any drawings of it. No one's ever drawn this. It's about to be drawn because this is all going into a publication that will come out at the end of the year. So here are the apartments, here are the workshops, and you can see that there's this link through between them. And what this does is it gives this incredibly important, for many people, separation between the world of home and the world of work. And in this case, home is quite clean and tidy, and here it's quite dirty, noisy, and probably quite dangerous work. And this still exists. And the amazing thing about these buildings is that there's a part of their, I can't remember what they call it, but there's some kind of a legal stamp on it that says they cannot be residential. Because obviously, if this was ever made residential, lordy, they would be worth £1.2 million overnight. Okay? So they're not. They're workspaces. Not many of them continue to be living and working spaces. But I put this in as an example of how we can build our cities to actually create the sorts of living and working spaces that people who are makers or visual artists, well, makers of all sorts, of any sorts of production, actually. And then, of course, there are numerous buildings designed specifically as artists' living and working spaces. So this is in Amsterdam. I can't actually remember how many units there are, but you can each one of the, this is a unit on the ground floor, this is one on the first floor, etc., etc. And this is the studio entrance, and then if you go to the other side, blow me, it's an ordinary block of flats. And so it's not beyond the wit of humanity to design buildings that accommodate these two uses. And in fact, they're some of the most, I think, but I wouldn't I? They're some of the most wonderful buildings that we can come across. This is one of the things that they didn't do when they built this was create a gallery space. And in fact, collective communal space turns out to be pretty important in these sorts of buildings. And so what they did was they put up a sort of temporary wall outside and they hung the gallery in the street.
Brilliant.
So all the artists from inside the building showed their work in the street. And this is still a building that is full of working artists today. So, but in the UK we've got a very particular history which I am ashamed to say we have spread quite widely across the world. And that is that at the end of the 19th century, there was really widespread opposition to home-based work. The employers didn't like it because it meant it reduced the amount of control they had over their workers. The unions didn't like it because they felt, both they were concerned about an unregulated workforce, exploited workforce, but they also felt that, believe it or not, it undermined their campaign for a male family wage. The social reformers didn't like it because they went into the slums and they found appalling conditions. But I have spent a happy summer going through the notebooks of Charles Booth, who did the first social survey of London at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And in fact, all the occupations there, what you can say is that they certainly exacerbated the problems of overcrowding and poor sanitation, but there were very, very few that were actually inherently harmful as occupations to be carried out at home. But finally, and maybe the most devastating, was that general conservative with a small c public opinion actually believed that the woman's place was in the home, being domestic and not being economically active. And so there was this enormous move to make the home into a clean, feminine, safe, quiet space, away from the male, dirty, dangerous world of work. And we're still stuck in that today. So that's why we've still got these sorts of things being built. However, there are all sorts of really exciting things happening. In Haringey, not much in the UK, so I'm starting with a really tiny example in the UK, and then we'll move on to much more interesting things in other parts of the world. In Haringey, there's something called a warehouse district, which is where there was which is owned by, it's a very interesting area. It's owned by a single Orthodox Jewish family, and they've owned it for generations, and they aren't interested in maximising profit. They're interested in it as a community entity, and they're interested in passing it down to their children. And so they've got all these old warehouses, and as happened in cities across the world, industry moved out, the creatives moved in. But in this situation, this has happened relatively recently, and the owners didn't mind. And so the owners have supported the creatives being in their warehouses. And what's grown up is something that has started to be called warehouse living, which is where you've got very large warehouse spaces that are inhabited by collectives of usually young people working in creative occupations of one sort or another. Collectively so they've usually got collective central workspace, communal workspace with quite big private sort of sleeping spaces. So they're also sort of private spaces where people can hang out without being with all their flatmates, if you like. So this is an example of the existing, I mean, we're very familiar with this, but this is exciting because this is an architect's vision, hasn't happened yet, it's still under wraps, we don't know if it's going to happen, but it's one of the first schemes that actually tries to build this from scratch. And this is his sketch for how it might be. And the idea is that it's sort of like low-rise apartment blocks, but much bigger units. It's very, very basic in terms of materiality and finishes. It's basically completely raw. There are no internal finishes. There are no fitted kitchens, etc., etc., etc. And then on each level, there is this outside yard space, which is collective for this one and for the one on the other side, so that they're paired all the way up with a serious size lift to accommodate it. And the idea is that there's an open living and working space that opens out onto this outside space, and that it's a completely different type of building to the ones that people are used to seeing as housing. Because, of course, they're dealing with the idea that if you do something that is messy and maybe smelly and takes up a lot of space, it usually doesn't fit into a conventional house. And that's why the whole sort of warehouse movement happened, the whole Soho loft thing, but that got very badly subverted by the property market because developers and politicians basically realised that they could make an enormous amount of money by turning what started out, I mean, everyone knows this story, it's boring, but I'll run through it just in case anyone doesn't. The inhabitation of light industrial buildings by artists hugely raised the sort of the social value of districts and buildings, and then the developers moved in and they capitalise on the economic value, and the artists get priced out immediately. Okay, so this is not a great building. I was really surprised when I saw it by Will Alsop. Anyway, it's not a great building, but it's an incredibly exciting scheme, because this is Toronto, and in Toronto, in the Triangle District of Toronto, there was a huge fight between the artists. It was one of those districts like in London, we've got Hackney Wick and Fish Island, which had 600 artists that are just being swept away at the moment, and it's being replaced by faceless condominiums just to maximise the profit of the developers.
As a community project, so that's the way to go, and that's all that we could do in the terms of neighbourhood plan to back that.
Yeah.
This all takes me right back to the whole public inquiry over the North Street development, because you know the South Downs National Park, which you think would be about preserving what's unique about a place, seemed to completely ignore the value in the whole creative hub that was developed and grown up in North Street, and people like Phoenix Rising were suggesting ways of building on that by making affordable housing within it. But instead, the National Park was much more interested in a clean sweep and starting again, and you know what's going there seems to me to be absolutely impossible. That it would create these kind of unique spaces. I think that's the real tragedy of what's happened to Main Street. Okay, it was a bit scruffy down there, but I've not really yet been quite sure what's wrong about having a scruffy bit of town where things can happen.
I think scruffy is good, and I think one of my other real complaints is that people have the idea that residential neighbourhoods have to be silent. It's like, why? You know, it's like, where did that come from? And it was the whole move to separating out the two things. And if you go back to the history of cities like Sheffield, steel-making
It
cities,
must be really noisy.
every street of terraced houses, as you go along, would be a big archway that a vehicle could go through. In the back would be workshops where people would be making knives, scissors, pulling nails, all sorts of stuff. And the neighbourhood, it had the noise and the smell, actually, of work going on at the same time. And in fact, there's a surprising number of people living on industrial estates. I've interviewed quite a lot of them, and they say, we love living on this. It's a perfect place to bring up children, you know, because during the day it's busy, there's lots going on, there's lots of people to talk to engage with, and in the evening of the weekend it's quite nice and quiet. So.
And to add to that, Francis, thank you, Susan, for that comment. I think absolutely right. So I mentioned Simpson I am the director of this Phoenix Rising, and that development is not yet going ahead. North Street is not.
I don't know. I appreciate that.
And it may yet
There is
come
hope.
back. There is hope.
Good.
A scintilla of hope.
Oh, I think more than that, Susan. We're still there, and we're keeping a very close eye on this, and one day we'll be back. But I think the two comments I have. One, this whole thing about tidiness. One of the things that local people talked about a lot when we were running the consultation on the future of North Street and the Phoenix estate was it's such an eyesore in town, and it really ought to be tidied up. And what was fascinating there was it was almost about there's awful people living in caravans or living in buses or doing their arty work, which is noisy and smelly and all of those things. Why don't we just get them out of this town, because it's making a terrible mess of the town. We want to be a tourist destination and yardy-dardy-don. That was a very big discussion point going on, and I think that's shameful.
And that comes from two things, I think. The first is this idea that the home is the clean, feminine place.
Yes.
Social housing,
Absolutely
there
right.
were rules. You had to scrub your doorstep every week.
Absolutely right.
The completely hidden agenda behind
Yeah.
the social reformers and the first social housing was to improve the morals
Yeah.
of the working classes. That continues.
Absolutely. And my second point is, and oddly enough, sorry, and this will sound terribly, I don't know what the word is for this, and some sort of prejudice I might have, but coming from a coal mining background, although I don't sound as though I do, I know, and the fact that the people who made those comments mostly were the people who live on the council estates in Lewis or the ex-council estates in Lewis, that was really quite telling for me.
Yes, but in a way it's to do with protecting the value of their property.
Absolutely. The second point I would make there then is about what is actually happening on there is an industrial estate in Lewis in the middle of the town, which is the Moorings industrial estate, which is where all the big sheds are. And what's happening there? They are going for residential development.
Of course they are.
Isn't that ironic? And we demonstrated that in when we were doing the plan for the estate, which is over the other side of the river, that residential would emerge into those, and that's exactly what's happening. Chris Oakley, who's in my mind, a very nice guy, local agent, Chris has spotted that market. He's buying up those industrial units that some of them are historic industrial units, converting them for resi, and that's happening on that. It's happening before our very eyes. And why don't we do it in because real places? Look at Lewis High Street, employment, residential, live hand in hand. Cheap by Dell, and that's how you make a real place.
It's how you make a real place. It means that there are people there 24 hours a day. You know, if you have
and it
these
distresses me hugely that Lewis District Council just does not get it. With all due respect to District Council, I know Susan has already made
I'm a
you get
dissenter.
it.
I'm a
So you get
dissenter.
it. Absolutely, I understand that. But that's we've got to do more to help.
But it's very, because what you're dealing with is advanced capitalism and this property-based economy, and I think you have to go in at that level.
But also,
so you have to
Francis,
subvert
the
this.
planning system doesn't help. I speak now as somebody who runs a planning consultancy. The moment you start to zone places, you kill places.
Yeah, but even if you have so-called mixed use, it's still vertical zoning. Because you've got a supermarket on the ground floor.
Although oddly enough, here's something else for us to grasp onto. the Tesco land that Tesco bought and they couldn't afford to redevelop because their business model fell to pieces, has a consent now for employment on the ground floor, residential on the upper floors. The National Park finally consented that, but I'm sorry to say, spoke to members of Friends of Lewis, and they wanted it to be a coach park for tourists, and I think that's a shambles. I think that again, that's shameful. I think that having mixed-use development on that sort of site is exactly the right thing to do. And who was that done by? But a local commercial developer.
Right, the point you made about the doorsteps and things, I mean, it was entrenched in policy for residential housing. There were people writing saying, you know, if the family isn't quite looking after itself, we'll move you out. You've got to you'll behave well. It's written into your lease virtually. The other observation was interesting is that you showed Beckenby, etc. And it's going to be some days. In fact, when you've got like masonette above a masonette, the deck access there. I mean, it was a simple trick like, oh, we need to double densities, we basically got houses, so we put some on top and put a deck access, and that's 4 stories. And then, oh well, we do it again, so you get 6 stories. All those masonette things and the deck access, that's what it was doing. So they're all plotted in there, and they're all the 2 bedrooms and the 1 bedroom, whatever. And I think the model which you showed of the live work issue is quite interesting because, I mean, a multi-story housing is so formulaic. I mean, it's the core, it's the service core, it's the bedroom. It's absolutely sort of programmed. You can't really deviate because it's some sort of things don't line up. What I was reflecting on is when I was talking to people in China about because they're in silos, and they say, oh, well, the people family don't need nurseries because the family looks after it. You have the courtyard housing with the head of the family there, then there's the other relatives, and a garden at the back, and they all move around over a period of each generation, and they look after each other. Yeah. And I thought, well, how does that? So, do you mean instead of actually what we do in the cellular home, above cellular home, and keep going, deck access, stair. So why don't they have their silo lots, I'm calling them, which are long, like all the courtyard houses stacked up as well, with a garden on one side, a courtyard, and then they could do all that stuff. They don't do that, I think, so they've got a real problem. But what's crazy about looking at the arrangement you showed, where maybe it's live, etc., is that it is much more flexible for whatever you do with it.
Exactly.
Instead of being like party wall, basically house in the air, flat in the air, repeat. It's much more fluid. We can do it design-wise easily. Yeah. So it needs to be much, and then you can knock one out and have a garden.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or you can do things.
Do whatever you want.
But the whole market is so geared up and streamlining with BIM, where you design a 3 dimensions, where you got 3 dimensions all networked out, so everything has to sort of, it's absolutely obsessive. And to corrupt that into a new model is quite a big ask, actually, but it needs to be done because because otherwise it's just repeating. It's a formula.
Well, that is the problem. Is that there's a formula for housing, and there's a formula for offices, and because it's driven by making money and not by providing space to actually meet the needs of people's everyday lives, which have changed so radically. You know, in my lifetime, the 50s, you know, women didn't go out to work. They were stuck at home looking after the children. And now there are more women in employment than ever before. And so the nature of the home has completely changed. But it's like everyone who's involved in building isn't interested because that's not the point. The point is to maximise the amount of money they can make out of it.
It has to be a standard formula product, a bit like you can't have 5 different designs of a panel or whatever. Because we'll take it on. So the flats are the same.
I don't think that's a good analogy.
Well, no.
Of course you can have 5 different sorts of houses.
No, not with that house building lot, Francis. You can't.
But if they're funding it, they need to know, look, if it's a 2-bedroom unit, it's going to have this, that's the area, that's it. It's very exciting. It's complicated for them.
Francis, John and I work with the commercial house builders, and when you get to work with Countryside or you work with Barclay Homes or whatever, they've got a standard product. That's what you get. End of.
Because
that's the disaster.
And that's the disaster.
But they're regarding currency. There's not currency. You know, if you say, I can sell you 32 bedroom flats, everyone knows exactly what they mean. Exactly. Every developer, every planner, everyone knows, and every person knows that's what you're going to get.
And these are the slums of the future.
They are.
Because there's absolutely no doubt that home-based work is going to increase. One thing I haven't touched on is the whole environmental issue, because the whole business about work and home getting further and further away from each other means you've got this phenomenal transport problem. And so if you're going to try and deal with that issue at an environmental thing, you have to make walking neighbourhoods. And so walkable neighbourhoods. So home-based working, it just ticks all the boxes. It means that the care of children, it means involvement in the community, it means the safety of streets, the eyes on the street. Getting rid of reducing the carbon emissions. I get apoplectic when I talk about it because it's so annoying. But there's this really, really easy solution that everyone loves. People really, really like working from home if they're in appropriate accommodation. That somehow, the developers have got this absolute iron grip on it.
Just before you start, Ian, how about we invite Francis to give a presentation to LDC?
Absolutely, yes. Wouldn't that be a lovely idea?
Or maybe to local developers.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they're the people that need to see that type of product might work. Planning authority. But I think what's really interesting about the Japanese examples are interesting because a lot of the real hip stuff coming out of Clerkenwell and indeed in Brighton, it's a bit of a global player in terms of the new sort of IT community, business community which is springing up, is that people like these kind of flexible ways of working.
Yes.
And it does, in a way, anticipate the way we might need to be working and living in the future. So I think if a developer had the right sort of mindset to see I can see that potential working, then you can imagine that model starting to be rolled out. But I guess there will be a little bit of consumer resistance to something which is new.
I think not. I think what you'll find is that there's an architect, Alison Brooks, who's done a scheme in Newhall outside Cambridge, which is nothing like this. It's a completely different approach. But she's designed houses that have a front room projecting towards the street, and blow me, it's got a big window in it. And it's exactly the place to put your desk or to put, it's not labelled work, because if you label it work, you have to pay capital gains tax, you have to pay business rates. Not labelled work, but they're all full of home-based workers. They were snapped up just like that. So I think this is a door, that's.
Well, a friend of mine had a big rental property on the high street, on School Hill, just over there, and 3 or 4 stories tall it was. And on the ground floor, or the top 3 floors, I should say, his family. That's where they were. But on the ground floor space, he had 7 people working in there at one point.
Well,
and
he
continued to grow, and now he couldn't find any other place in Lewis, so now he's had to get places in Brighton for his business.
Yeah.
So it was a shame that Lewis couldn't accommodate that. But what I was going to go on to say, it's sort of an appeal that, and it talks really about what Oliver's kind of like suggesting. Is this? I think some aspects of community infrastructure does need to be ring fenced. So it's a great shame we've thrown the bathwater out, or the baby out with the bathwater down at North Street in a way, because there was this fantastic community which had evolved over time, and you just can't engineer that. That's a grassroots thing in no uncertain terms. But if we can in future try and ring fence, we need those kind of like rundown buildings, those scruffy buildings to stay. And a really good example of that is over in Brighton. I don't know how many people know New England House.
Yes.
New England House is not residential. It was built in the 1960s. I think you'd find it really fascinating to look at. It was designed as a light industrial tower block.
Oh, okay.
It's about 7 or 8 stories tall. Big, tall ceilings, huge concrete floors, big goods lifts. And it's got an incredible community of people that make things, recording studios, bakers, building services engineers, and very struggling architects, people like that. It's just an incredible sort of like tower of people doing stuff, making things. And Brighton Hove City Council keep it going. They're going to have a problem with the old curtain walling. It is 1960s curtain walling, cladding the building, and it's got to be redone. But they have kept it going, and they do appreciate that there is a hidden
financial benefit which leaks out into the rest of the
Totally.
city.
2 points. One is that Jane Jacobs, the sort of great urban thinker, theorist of the 1960s, 70s, one of her absolute principles was that you had to have buildings of different ages and
Quite.
conditions.
Yeah, yeah.
You've
And therefore
got to
different rents or
have
rental
cheap,
years.
scruffy buildings in any neighbourhood, because then you get the sort of people who are mending shoes, maybe, rather than the sort of television executives. And then you get a whole sort of layering and complexity of diversity of occupation and economics. That was the first point. What was the other point? Yeah, I've forgotten it. It doesn't matter.
Nick,
Do you think there's any potential for transitionary arrangements? I'm thinking particularly of property guardian companies coming in. And also there was a fantastic Making Lewis thing by Christoph making geodesic domes, temporary, but particularly good one on the waterfront in Copenhagen that was used for a few years, and got the community to realise what was possible, and get ahead of steam, if you like, to take something forward. Do you think there's potential? The Spitalfields site, Old Street there.
Yeah.
I'm thinking there was a lot of houses that were empty because the property prices were going up so quick it could never keep up with plans to develop it. And an interim use rather than dereliction can often
I
get
suppose,
community support for something.
I think it's a disaster that squatting was made illegal. I was a squatter, and I think that thing about young, creative people going into empty properties is only a good thing. You know, and I was evicted from a building by the police, who then proceeded to go through and smash up the toilet and the basin and the bath and everything to make sure we couldn't go back in. So things like that. So yes, in principle, but I think the guardianship thing is really tricky, because basically it's a way of people making money. The guardians pay quite a lot of money rent. If they were doing it for nothing, I think it'd be fine. I think it'd be great. But they pay a surprising amount of rent, and the conditions that they inhabit those buildings are terrible. And so not only poor services and things like that, that doesn't matter if you're paying practically nothing, but also they can be evicted with very, very little notice. So I think that's really tricky.
Yeah.
Can I just make a quick point? I'm not from Lewis, I'm not an architect, I'm not a planner.
Well, we're all nice people, planners.
Just about to talk. But just a kind of an observation is I was talking to a friend who would be probably known as a garden grabber, wants to build a house in the bottom of her garden, and is putting it off because of the prospect that properties would drop by 35% if we crash out of Brexit in a no-deal situation. Do you think that might be, if it does happen, A, a good thing that prices do crash, and B, an opportunity for everybody to rethink actually where property sits in that kind of whole wealth management?
I think that there will be a property crash. I think there needs to be a property crash.
Yeah.
I think that property and investment need to be separated. I think property needs to become just spaces where people inhabit. But the problem with wanting a property crash is we know who's going to really suffer, and that's the people who are the most vulnerable. There will be a property crash, and I think ultimately it will be a good thing, but I think the suffering is going to be terrible. So,
But could it be the catalyst for some kind of major change that's potential?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time it had crashed and just gone back into the same cycle.
No, but well, could I join in this debate just by saying that if that happens, then maybe we'll finally get around to sharing, working out a mechanism for sharing the increase in land values that we get when we give planning permission for development.
yes, that would be a very obvious first step.
And that, you know, over the years, 1947 was the first time we really did it properly, and it's come and gone and come and gone. and maybe it would happen this
Yeah,
time.
I think it might. I mean, I have quite extreme views on in this field, and I think we should stop, as New Zealand has, stop allowing people who aren't UK residents to buy property.
Yes.
You know, and that would just kill the
The London situation.
the market-
Yeah, absolutely.
straight away.
Yeah.
And I can't see the problem. And I
No.
think but what I know is the problem is that the people who make the decisions are actually benefiting from the
Correct.
property market soaring. And
Correct.
so we're pretty stuck, really. You know, it's a sort of problem
But
with.
there are politicians who are suggesting this as an idea, land value.
Yes, there are, and I think Larry Elliott.
On both sides of the, actually, oddly enough.
No.
Today the Tory conference is starting in Brighton. By the end of the week we might not have our current Prime Minister.
Indeed.
On that cheery
That's
note,
optimistic.
Very
I want to bring good news. On that cheery note, thank you again, Francis.
Absolutely.
Maybe the level of response by everyone just now to Francis shows how interested and how provocative and how relevant what she's shown is to Lewis. The fact that it got there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if there are ways we can draw our various public guardians into a conversation about what Francis is talking about, I'm all for it and will help in any way. I think Francis should as well.
I'm completely up for it.
Yeah.